One of the things you can notice is the difference between this format and, say, for instance, the CNN or MSNBC format is they're giving them a substantial amount of time to go back and forth and debate, raise different kinds of issues, go into different kinds of complexities. It's a very different forum. Let's see. So just a second while this pulls up a little bit. So one of the things we see, we'll go back to them, but we see in the last couple of segments, we saw Professor Harris Lacewell outline what are the core tenets of black feminism, right? You can't separate race and gender. There's been a historical oppression of black women, both within the context of the feminist movement and within the context of struggles for racial equality. Black women have to struggle simultaneously against racism and sexism. She raises the issues of class and sexual orientation in many ways the way lots of black feminists do, without a whole lot of in-depth analysis of those necessarily. That just a bit of a critique. But at the same time, then she then turns around to say, we can't, she even uses a phrase, I can't separate myself, my blackness, or my womanhood from one another. And she's charging that the article tried to draw a distinction, right, a hard line between the oppression of women and the oppression of black men, and to suggest, right, so therefore, if women are never front runners, it suggests what? In the context of this debate. So women are never front runners, and it suggests that black men are. And are in some sort of regular way in which they don't face particular barriers in being so. Okay, here's the last segment. So any thoughts, questions? Yeah. She was very uncomfortable. She was obviously underprepared. She had put an article out, which was, I would argue, a distortion of what she knew better in terms of the kinds of directions that feminism had begun to go in terms of addressing questions of racism. And she did it in order to, and see, she's kind of saying, oh, well, she's not really involved in the campaign. But there's a number of points where she gives a number of Clinton talking points. One is that she was voting to authorize the war, but not for the war. She gives that one. And it's pretty stunning, right? Because Gloria Steinem's another part of her major life is that a significant part of second wave feminism coalesced around opposition to the Vietnam War and a distinctly peace orientation towards the question of U.S. military involvement abroad. So she's sort of backpedaling there, and then I just think that she's underprepared, and if I had to describe at least some of the way that she comes off is there's a substantial amount of condescension, right? A kind of, how dare this young black woman say this to me? I'm Gloria Steinem, and how dare she sort of lay out my positions in such an aggressive fashion? And so she didn't expect anyone. She's usually expected, particularly. She's an icon on the left. She's going on Democracy Now! So I think she expected to be sort of, treated with the kind of kid gloves, right? I'm going to be treated with the sort of due respect that someone who is an icon has. And Melissa just, goes out and comes right after her. And I think that point where she references Lonnie Guinier, who was labeled because of her arguments for preference voting, her interest in affirmative action was attacked by Republicans the Clintons tried to appoint her as the chairman of the EEOC in the Justice Department, and she was labeled by Republicans as the quota queen, a distinct reference to the old stereotype of the black woman welfare queen used by Ronald Reagan. And the Clintons withdrew her nomination. Actually, so Gloria Steinem starts going into preference voting, and then you can see Melissa gives a kind of smile, because it's like she's delivering the haymaker at that point. It's like, okay, you know, it's like in boxing, it's like a bolo punch, you know, where you sort of wind it up, you know, just because your opponent really doesn't know what they're doing. So she walked into it, and she really wasn't sort of prepared for the debate. Yeah.
Just made me think in general of just like the kind of like the academic world, where usually people of color, to be able to succeed, they have to not only be as equal, but they have to top it off even more. And that's what I saw there, like, you know, white women, please, you know, just respect, which is not performing at all that well, but you know, black women, she has to go up and beyond, and she performed so there. So it's like, remind me of generally, like, you have to go up and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there was a kind of asymmetry in the sort of media savvy, the level of articulation, the sort of thoughtfulness. You know, she basically starts inviting her out to tea, or saying, you know, call me, you know, let's get together and talk, and you know, yeah.
I think, like, when I look at her, all I thought was, like, I could imagine her, like, I don't know, 30 years back, like, wearing just, like, bell bottoms and stuff. She just reminded me of a hippie, in that they kind of had this ideal of, like, peace and love, but they didn't really do anything about it or know how to go about it. You know, they didn't have a set plan, they didn't, I don't know.
I think you're. I mean, some of her kind of presentation, and she's a little languid in the way that she responds. But she's a tough political actor, right? I mean, and she and was a very, you know, savvy person in terms of developing a strong sort of political line, a set of ideological principles, fighting for things like the ARA and abortion rights. You know, she's no pushover. I think she thought that she sort of owned this territory, and that what she had done was to kind of expose this kind of thing, and she's probably not the sort of increasing sophistication with which black feminists have been challenging these kinds of things. Like there's even one moment where she says something sort of stunning, and she's like, so you know, she raises this question that, like, sort of if the suffrage coalition had held together, right, you know, this wouldn't have happened because black women and white women would have gone to the polls together. Well, it ignores the fact that it was racism that broke the coalition. It was racism on the part of the white women that broke the coalition apart. And so the central question that she really doesn't want to deal with, and in particular that she never really gives any voice or construction to, is the degree to which racism has been a real significant barrier. She's willing to grant gender, but in the context of this debate, she's always sort of questioning the degree to which racism is a kind of significant barrier in American life. And so in that sense, she sort of pays a lip service in the early parts of her article by using this sort of hypothetical black woman. And I mean, and in the interesting ways is right, that sort of article and even these kinds of arguments never really dealt with the sort of range of different ways in which Hillary Clinton was privileged, right? She's married to an ex-president. It's not, that provides a certain kind of privilege that even most women don't enjoy. And so if you think about a kind of intersectional analysis, it takes into account sort of race, gender, class. She's straight, you know, both of them are heterosexual. That's another kind of point of privilege that isn't even taken into account. The kinds of apparatus, the sort of fundraising possibilities that Clinton had as a result of having her husband been president. So in many senses, this debate really sort of crystallized, really in a kind of, you know, 15, 20 minute in a 25-minute format really crystallizes the divisions and some of the sort of bad feelings and bad blood between black feminists and white feminists. Here, what we don't see is, we see vague mention, but we don't see the issues and conflicts between black feminists and other ideologies in the black public sphere. So if we go back to what we did before, so the core ideas of black feminism, womanism, race is a central point of oppression, though not the only point of oppression. Gender is also a central point of oppression and is a problem, both in the larger society but in the black community. The two often intersect. That is black women experience being both women and women in a society that is sexist, and being black in a society that is racist. And to varying degrees, they also engage questions of how one experiences class and sexuality, and they argue for simultaneous struggles. So black women must struggle simultaneously against racism and sexism, and to a certain degree, classism and heteronormativity, depending upon how much they emphasize the latter two. And so the idea is that you can't separate the two. And that a women's organization, right, that sees its goal as only struggling against sexism is not representing the interest of black women. A black organization that is only fighting against racism, that isn't simultaneously struggling against sexism, is not a black organization, because it's muting a central component of slightly over half of the black population, which is the concerns that black women have about problems of sexism, right? So, and so their argument is that you have to square the circle. But another point that they have is that, therefore, frequently in contrast, to white women, right, who see in particular white men as one of the sort of central barriers in society in the feminist movement, black women have to simultaneously work not only to remove barriers of sexism and racism, but they have to struggle on behalf of black men. That is a central part of them understanding their communities. And when you engage, in particular in the sort of modern context, a significant part of that many black women are the custodial or single parent of male children, you see that often that is a kind of significant issue for them as well, right? They cannot adopt a kind of feminism which sees the role and advancement of men as kind of a superfluous ideal, right? They have to struggle on behalf, frequently, of their black male children as well. And also, just like, say, for instance, Angela Davis, they have to struggle on behalf of black men in general, right? So Angela Davis sees, even as a feminist, sees the massive incarceration of black men as a kind of central issue that isn't sort of outside of her thing. She's not like, so why should I care about that? Because it is simultaneously a product of racism in the way in which she sees things. So it's a much more, and as you saw with Professor Harris Lacewell, it's a much more integrated approach, which seeks to not sort of take different identities and place them into their bins and construct organizations around individual identities, but it argues that we have to be constantly talking about these things. And so as a result of that, black women have had a number of different kinds of organizations that I think one could call feminists in their orientation. You had the Black Women's Club movement, which things like the National Council of Negro Women. These organizations were designed around the theme of racial uplift, right? That these women, mostly sort of professional, middle-class black women in the era of segregation, were going to work to improve the lot of black communities, but also at the same time, while improving the lot of the entire community, would struggle. Many of them were professional women and had their own kind of struggles about what role they would play in that racial uplift, and not wanting to play a backseat role. You had the invention of black fraternities, but also black sororities, which in many ways mirrored the Black Women's Club movement. And many of the people who were in one have frequently overlapped in the other. I would argue that one of the unique organizations that emerges out of the kind of 60s ethos, early 70s ethos, is the Combahee River Collective, which actually articulates the beginning of a kind of intersectional perspective, and argues for the first time for the inclusion of women with various kinds of queer sexualities in the context of the women's movement, but again articulates clearly that black women must simultaneously struggle against racism and sexism, and that black men, despite the fact that they are obviously feminists, are articulating and affirming queer sexualities, et cetera, they still see black men as being a central part of any kind of liberation that they would find as part of advancing the sort of politics and aims and goals of their group. Another group that emerged actually out of the confirmation and the sort of hearings that you saw between Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, and the organization was called African-American Women in Defense of Ourselves. It was a collection of many academics and others. They took out a full-page ad in the New York Times under the auspices of How We Do, people like writer artist Alice Walker and others, and the basic line in How We Do was that the hearings themselves and the fact that Anita Hill's protestations about Thomas's sexually harassing behavior fell on deaf ears represented a kind of a continued public denigration of black womanhood. That black womanhood was not something that either needed to be valued or protected. The rights of black women could easily be dismissed. And they were equally upset about the ways in which many actors, but including the Senate, really dismissed Hill's concerns, as well as many African-American male actors didn't also themselves rally to Hill's defense, as neither did large organizations of white feminists. So in many senses, How We Do developed a kind of a construction of a kind of sense that they had been, that black women were currently in that debate, were under attack, and needed to get out what their issues were and how they sort of understood the divisions in the hearing, that you couldn't easily divide the hearings between race and gender, right? You had a woman and a black man, you had a black man and a black woman with equal sort of claims. So black feminists have had a series of struggles. One struggle has been against white feminists. We've seen that kind of ad nauseum. Another struggle has been against black nationalists, in particular cultural nationalists. Cultural nationalists, as I mentioned before when we went over cultural nationalism, has more often than not repeated and trumpeted very traditional roles for women, traditional, or how shall I say, conservative or backward roles for women in the context of the struggle for racial equality. So you have writers like Maulana Karenga writing that gender equality is a white concept, that in Africa, black men and women have to complement one another. So what does it mean to complement one another? It means that women have to take a subordinate position to black men. That's what it means when he says complement. Complementarity and not equality means that you do the hard work and I take the glory. That's exactly what sort of Karenga and others mean. And then some of them, you know, like I've never really, I need to ask someone this, but sort of, you know, when folks like Maulana Karenga show up, he always is flanked by sort of, you know, two women with these sort of afros and in their garb and stuff like that. And I'm not sure if they're sort of both in some sense his wives. So some of them have even reinvented the, you know, that polygamy is not just for Mormons, that it's a African practice that needs to be reinvigorated to restore and strengthen the black family. Of course, we can also see, in particular, with the other sort of cultural nationalist organization being the Nation of Islam, it has frequently, the Nation of Islam has often adopted some of the much more culturally and conservative takes on gender equity and expressions of sexuality amongst women that are contained within very conservative manifestations of Islam, but as well as black nationalism more essentially in that sense. It's sort of doubly and similar, and so in that sense, right? So, you know, while I don't want to see this as the central point, but the Nation of Islam encourages black women to wear the hijab, the headscarf, etc. And in some cases, even for instance, when Mike Tyson was involved, and one of these sort of interesting things about this the kind of conservative view of sexuality in sort of black nationalist circles is that, you know, it often gives sexual license to men, right? You know, so you can have multiple wives, you may have multiple partners, but to the degree to which women, in particular black women, utilize sexual agency, it means that they, you know, either should be punished or rightfully punished. So for instance, in the context, and also sort of bringing up, in particular, sexual victimization or victimization by black men is often seen as black women conspiring with white male racism. So to take an example of this, when Mike Tyson was being convicted of raping Desiree Washington, a black woman, Farrakhan came out very openly in support and saw the conviction as being a racist attack against Mike Tyson's black manhood. There's a problem with that, right? Because there's a black woman involved who claims to have been sexually assaulted. And so if we cannot talk about sexual assault or domestic violence within the context of black communities, because it raises this question of, well, doesn't it just affirm racist stereotypes, or isn't it just the racist criminal justice system coming to attack another black man? It silences the implicit thing is that it silences the ability of black women to speak out about the experiences that they've had. And so in that sense, black nationalists have frequently sought to silence these kinds of issues. And even in the context of, say, for instance, the Black Panther Party and other organizations, while the Black Panther Party was officially committed to gender equity, frequently in practice that fell far short of the mark. But we see in particular in organizations like the Nation of Islam, you get, you know, people like Farrakhan giving a full-throated defense of Mike Tyson without even perhaps considering that Mike Tyson had harmed or assaulted Desiree Washington, and even suggesting that if he had, she perhaps deserved it, right? What was she doing going to his hotel room at that time of night? That's not something that a proper woman does. those kinds of very, very familiar and backward sort of relationships about that women, so therefore that because she is acting not as a proper woman, she therefore makes herself vulnerable to being attacked, exploited, and raped in this kind of way. And so therefore people like Farrakhan and others have frequently kind of adopted those kinds of lines in sort of unproblematic fashions that implicitly sort of silence black women, or again, is in order to translate into black conservatism, develop notions of good women and bad women. And good women are ones who serve black men, stay within the confines of what we understand to be sort of, bourgeois heteronormative sexuality and the nuclear family. Good women don't go to boxers' hotel rooms late at night, and therefore, and it's important that women be good or conform to these kinds of good black women, even if victimized by black men, don't tell the authorities or don't speak out about it, because speaking out about it harms the unity and cohesiveness of the black community. They're not supposed to air their dirty laundry in public. This becomes a line that also becomes trumpeted by black conservatives who have a kind of equal commitment, along with black nationalists, a kind of co-equal commitment to notions of respectability and heteronormativity, and a commitment to the sanctity of the nuclear family. We've seen, while the Black Panther Party stands out, we see on sort of questions of gender and sexuality that black conservatives and black nationalists frequently converge together. So they're often anti-gay and lesbian, right? That doesn't reflect the kind of sexual orientation or sexual activity that reproduces the nation. They want to impose a structure of the nuclear family. They're frequently, both black nationalists and black conservatives are very often frequently very critical of women who choose to raise children on their own, even if in cases where the man that they happen to be with is violent or otherwise, or drug addicted, or has a series of other problems that places the family in danger. So those are a set of things that one doesn't take into account. So one of them is about women's agency and women's role is to serve and construct and help to support a black family that is headed by, quote unquote, in their minds, in both the minds of sort of most black nationalists and black conservatives, rightfully headed by the black man. And for black nationalists, the black nation is rightfully headed by black men. For black conservatives in particular, they're much more interested in the black family. The black family is rightfully headed by a black man. And so therefore, women who are seeking to advance themselves in the workplace, who make difficult choices to raise children on their own, or choose or who decide to express their sexuality outside of heterosexual relationships, in particular lesbians or with other women, are violating core principles of advancing the black family in the case of conservatives, and the black family vis-a-vis the black nation in the case of black nationalists. And so therefore, black feminists these have been sort of very difficult struggles that black feminists have had, in particular very, very stark ideological struggles, in which the sexist narrative is essentially almost in many cases coded into the DNA of certain strains of black nationalism and certain strains of and generally in black conservatism. That is the negative approach that sexism is a necessary and constitutive component of many of those philosophies, with kind of some of the exception of Black conservatism. Black women also had struggles within the context of radical egalitarian organizations against sexist behavior and sexist ideals. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was even criticized for the way women were treated in the context of civil rights organizations. And what I'll say is that not necessarily about the sort of radical egalitarian ethos, that it was not sort of coded. There was no sort of mandate for sexism as it is in the constructions of the Black nation or Black conservative thinking, but that there was certainly a kind of practice in that radical egalitarian organizations and the sort of day-to-day practices of the Black men who operated them were largely in connection with and in dialogue with the broader sexist society in which they lived. As well as similarly, the radical egalitarian organizations also had issues around and have continued to struggle with the questions of homophobia. That is, sort of Bayard Rustin, the original architect, a gay male, who was one of the original architects of the March on Washington, was not allowed to speak at the march because it was perceived that would cast disrepute on the entire march by having a person who was not a heterosexual speaking at the march. Similarly, again, as I've stated before, these organizations have struggled with sexism in terms of women being asked to perform tasks of organizing things and doing all the work, but not being recognized for their leadership. The struggles of women like Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker, and people like Fannie Lou Hamer is not sort of recognized, along with the struggles of men, in particular heterosexual men. Also, similarly, groups of activists struggled with writers and others like James Baldwin, who was known for being gay, and were sometimes marginalized within the context of the Black community because of his sexual orientation. So in many ways, these sort of questions of heteronormativity, masculinity, and a kind of sexual issues and a kind of reference to, in particular, bourgeois middle class norms around the nuclear family have as much been a part of the Black community as they have been in the larger community, and sometimes in many cases exaggerated. If we think about it, to sort of cast a kind of critical eye, if we think about, in some ways, the kind of fascination with the Obama family currently in the public, in some ways it's about because the family represents the kids are cute and all that stuff, but if you listen underneath, a lot of what's being said is that this is an atypical Black family because of the representation of respectability. The mom and dad are together. They are ostensibly taking care of their kids. They focus on their education. They are a model nuclear heterosexual family in every way that we can imagine them to be. And in some ways, interestingly enough, that story gets emphasized in contrast to sort of Barack Obama's personal story, which he does at moments talk about, which isn't the sort of People magazine family, which is a much more sort of complicated history of being raised by a white single mom, et cetera. And we even saw Melissa Harris Lacewell mention that herself, being a non-married mother, et cetera. Yes?
How does the role of Michelle Obama play into that? Because it almost seems like she's represented as like a very strong, powerful woman.
Yeah, and that's a kind of I don't know if you listened, but Melissa Harris Lacewell's next book that she's working on is entitled "When Colored Girls Considered Politics When Being Strong Wasn't Enough." And frequently the kind of construction of the strong Black woman is another kind of image that in some ways they're playing with, because the strong black woman in many ways is a sort of anchor and pillar of the community, sometimes a matriarch, sometimes not. The woman who works, who helps take care of the kids, who does everything, but who consistently subordinates or sacrifices her own aspirations for those of her family, and in particular, generally her man. That is the kind of image, and so in some ways, Michelle does sort of fall into that. And then, but when she ends up being a little sort of either too critical or stepping outside that, it is, and it's tough to